Hello and welcome to the Transfers podcast powered by FootballTransfers.com, a new podcast where we aim to bring you the news before it becomes news, plus insight and analysis on that most important of the least important things, football. I'm Ronan Murphy, I'm your host for this week. I'm one of the writers and the social media producer for FootballTransfers.com, and you may have seen me on Twitter. This week, as always, I'm joined by Duncan Castles, who needs no introduction, so I'll give him none.
Thank you, Ronan, and thank you for filling in and hosting duties. We are delighted to have you on the podcast.
Great. It's nice to be here as a long-term listener, first-time caller. Isn't that what they say on the radio shows? Yeah.
So what's your question, caller?
My questions will all be Republic of Ireland related because I don't support a football club, because when I grew up I used to support my local League of Ireland team, Kilkenny City, but they went bankrupt. So then I moved my allegiance to the next local League of Ireland club, Kildare County, who went bankrupt the following year. So I don't support any club team. So I only support the Republic of Ireland. So all my questions will be on Republic of Ireland or former League of Ireland clubs, ones that are now defunct. So I don't have any questions this week. We'll move on to our main focus on the chat, which is the English transfer market. And obviously the team to start with is always Manchester United, because I remember when I was working for Goal and I was at the 2018 World Cup in Russia, and after the kind of infamous Switzerland-Serbia game where some of the players did the Albanian Eagles celebration, and Xhaka and Shaqiri, who have obviously they have Kosovar Albanian heritage, and there was big issues with that before they played Serbia and about the kind of political situation over there, and they did the controversial celebration, and Stefan Lichtsteiner, who was not of that background, he joined in the celebration, and I was lucky enough after to speak to him in the mixed zone and get an exclusive with him. I got some great quotes from him about why he had done it and how some things are bigger than football, and then I asked him a question because he was about to play Matic in the Premier League. I asked him a kind of a throwaway question about Matic, and that was the one that got all the attention on Goal, and the controversial celebration didn't get. So Manchester United is the team that obviously sells newspapers, so that's why we'll start on the podcast with Manchester United this week. So Man United are looking to re-establish themselves under Sir Jim Ratcliffe. I know you have some insight on that and what the strategy is there now at the moment.
Yeah, it's interesting, Ronan. As we know, they made a number of changes at executive level, with Ratcliffe bringing in Dave Brailsford as a kind of Svengali figure in the camp. They want Dan Ashworth from Newcastle United. They've already taken Jason Wilcox from Southampton, previously Manchester City. Omar Barada coming in from Manchester City to be the chief executive. And they've been thinking very hard about how they turn this oil tanker that seems to be stuck on the rocks for years and years now back into a superpower again. And one of the things that's coming through is they feel like the Glazers and the previous executive team haven't really utilised the status of Manchester United properly in terms of recruiting players, in terms of building a team, building an academy, attracting younger players, building the squad that can compete with the top teams in Europe. And they think one of the things they can do to turn things around is change that status of the club, make them act like an elite sporting institution, believe they're an elite sporting institution, and implement changes that make them more attractive to the top talent. So they want to re-establish themselves and make themselves like a Real Madrid of football or a Ferrari of motorsports.
Maybe not Ferrari this season. Red Bull.
Yeah, not Ferrari this season, but I think the idea there is Ferrari will always have an attraction.
That's it. Lewis Hamilton going to them.
Yes. Yeah. That's the idea. If you can reorganise in a way that you're attracting the best talents, either when they're attainable, they want to avoid signing established talents. So we've seen Ratcliffe, I think, in the last week, talk about he doesn't want to sign Mbappe or Jude Bellingham at the top of the market. He wants to find the next Jude Bellingham and the next Kylian Mbappe. So the strategy there is, one, and another thing we've seen in the past week, improve the infrastructure of the club, the physical infrastructure of the club. So they've announced a £50 million investment in the men's first team building at Carrington, which they've been very unhappy with the quality of the facilities there. So they want to have best of class facilities that they can bring a player like Jude Bellingham when he was at Birmingham City, which is something that actually happened, bring him to Carrington, show him around the training ground, introduce him to the top people in their institution, introduce him to the players, and have him feel that this is the place he wants to develop his career at, not have him decide, I'm going to go to Borussia Dortmund because that's a better career path for me. So I think it sounds like whiteboard thinking, but I think there is actually a sense of coherent strategy there, because they do have that name to work with, they do have the history to work with, and then if they can add the bits around it where they make themselves attractive to the players, and then use their financial capability and target it on a certain cadre of players. And that's another thing they're talking about. It's when it's young talent, we're going to be prepared to spend whatever it takes to get them in. So we need to reorganise in a way that we're attractive to these guys, and then focus our energies on that, and then build a team, build a squad of players that are capable of competing with Manchester City and competing with Real Madrid for the Champions League title.
Yeah, so obviously it's something that we've seen before, that there was a path for these young players to get into the first team, but I suppose since maybe the 1990s it's been shut off for a lot of them. The class of 92 was obviously talked about so much, these players that came through together and grew together. So obviously imagine they're looking back to that, because that's what you used to see in these classic English teams, like even Arsenal, Invincible's team. Some of them had come through the academy, and they were set up to have these amazing academies that would bring players through. And I think maybe at the time when Bellingham went to Dortmund, he could see that there was a better path to playing in the Champions League or playing in Bundesliga, and that's why he chose Borussia Dortmund. Because I spoke to some of his coaches at Birmingham City for a feature I did before while he was at Borussia Dortmund, and they said that was the main reason that he chose it, because his father is obviously a man whose head is very screwed on and wants what's best for his son, and could see that was a better kind of way of moving, because he had been so experienced at that stage with Birmingham City. It wasn't like you were getting this truly raw player. You were getting a player who's used to playing men's football week in, week out, so he needed that to continue his career. You can't go from being a star in the Championship to being on the bench or at the reserves of Manchester United. You need Manchester United to show that the path is there for them.
Absolutely. I think you're right in highlighting Bellingham and highlighting his father. They have been extremely strategic about building a career, and they chose Dortmund because the development pathway was right. And I think if you compare the development pathway at Manchester United that was offered to them to the one they selected at Dortmund, he'd have been coming into a struggling first team environment. I don't think there was the same guarantee of first team football to start with. Dortmund will say, we bring you because we want to invest in you. The plan is to sell you on in 2-3 years' time. We're not going to pretend about that. Therefore, you go in the first team and we develop you. And our focus is on that because it's fundamental to the progression of the club. With Manchester United, they came in at a time when there were a lot of top clubs trying to secure Bellingham, because it was obvious that he was going to be a major talent going forward. And they made their best pitch, but their best pitch wasn't as attractive. One, because of the pathway, but two, I think, because of the environment he was coming into. And this is another thing that Brailsford, Ratcliffe, Wilcox and co are looking at, is Manchester United has turned into a team where they're accustomed to losing, where they're accustomed to drawing games, where it doesn't hurt a lot of the players enough when they fail to deliver on the pitch. And they know that cadre of players has to change. So a lot of the work this summer and going forward is going to be about clearing out individuals who have the wrong attitude, in order to build the framework that when you hire these top young talents, they've got not just a pathway into a team, but exemplars in the team and a culture which will benefit them and help get the best out of the potential of their career.
Yeah, I suppose that's what any parent wants for their son or daughter coming through into a club is just they want the best for their career. And for a lot of these players at that age or whatever, has Manchester United been what's best for their career? And you would say for a lot of them, no, because how many recent success stories have they had of the signings that they've made in the Glazer era? Very few, I'd imagine.
I think the counter argument would be Kobe Mino, Alessandro Garnacho, that they have still managed to bring some into the team. But if you ask, for example, Erik Ten Hag, and this is another subject we should talk about, if you ask Erik Ten Hag during last season, one of his many complaints about the organisation of Manchester United was he did not feel the academy was good enough, did not feel the academy was organised well enough to train the talent and help get them into the first team. So there's although it hasn't been a complete failure, I don't think we can say that. The guys who have been in the system, and we can go back to previous coaches. I know Jose Mourinho and his coaching staff had reservations about the quality of the academy, also the quality of the medical department, which is something that Ten Hag has big reservations about. There has been these flaws in the system and there's things that can be improved. And I think Brailsford, it probably wasn't very hard for Brailsford and Co to identify these things, but they are now targeting them. And I think this is the only way Manchester United can really catch up, is to be very surgical and very careful about how they invest the money that's come in off the back of the Ineos partial takeover in making exactly the right decisions to gradually build up and improve and get the level to something that's properly competitive in England again.
Yeah, I imagine Manchester United fans will then have to be patient about this process, because this isn't something that happens overnight. This is something that will take time. It's going to be a gradual thing, and maybe that's part of why Ten Hag has been kept on, would you think?
Yeah, I think you are absolutely spot on there, Ronan. I think retaining Ten Hag, and it's clearly a tense situation. We can see from what Erik Ten Hag was saying after it was announced that he'd be staying, the interview he gave in Dutch TV, and some quite kind of caustic remarks about they had an end of season review and they decided they already had the best manager, and others along those lines. This is not something that was done in a straightforward, we think you're great, we're not going to look at other coaches, we've decided you're staying. They did have extensive conversations with other coaches. There's this great story about Dave Brailsford's 60th birthday party where they invited Graham Potter, Maurizio Pochettino and Gareth Southgate to the party, and had this kind of managerial speed dating event in amongst various other guests. Which
there should be an app for that. It will be quicker. You could just swipe right on Southgate and left on Pochettino.
Yeah, not a bad idea, but actually I think that is a sign of quite intelligent and unusual thinking. If you get these guys in a room and put them in a party and have the opportunity to speak to them and see how they interact with everyone, it's quite a good pseudo-interview process. Anyway, they decided against all of those. Obviously, the FA Cup win and the reaction to Manchester United support was a big element in this. That made it difficult for them to sack Ten Hag and change. But on the other side, it's who do you bring in? And is he an obvious improvement? And if you look at this broader problem, what do we have to do to rebuild Manchester United? And we've just discussed the strategy they're putting together and it needing to be a longer, medium to long-term process and requiring patience from the supporters. Then actually maybe keeping Ten Hag becomes quite a rational thing. One, because the supporters are behind him suddenly off the back of the FA Cup, and dismissing him isn't going to do you any favours with the supporters. So utilise that kind of welling up of sympathy for Ten Hag, or enthusiasm for Ten Hag that's generated by the FA Cup success beating Manchester City. And two, if you've got a clear decks, it's great to use a manager who's already got quite a lot of capital broken by his 2 years in the job to clear the decks. If you've got to get players out, let him be the hatchet man. Let him, he wants change himself. It's his change. If his change, his decisions on which players should go out match your decisions on which players go out, then let him be the guy who does the nasty work and utilise them for as long as you can. If he gets results this season coming, great. You carry on with that. If he doesn't, then you're able to say, we tried, the supporters wanted them to stay, it seemed like the right thing to do at the moment, but it's turned out that it isn't the right thing to do, so now we have to bring our guy in.
Yes, obviously he'll be the man to get rid of some of these big names, but do you have any insight on what names they might bring in? Because I know that's what the Manchester United fans have been sticking around listening to me for this long to wait on and see what kind of player should we expect Manchester United to be looking at in this transfer window.
I think it's pretty clear it's not going to be top of the market signings. I think you see that from Ratcliffe's words, and that from the bids they've been putting in players so far. They've already made an offer to Everton for Jared Branthwaite, who has that lots of things in his favour. One is that he plays for Everton, and Everton are desperate for cash. Two, he's a left-footed centre-back who's also very good off his right foot. So he's one of the most ambipedal centre-backs or players in the Premier League in terms of the amount of times he passes with right foot, left foot, which means he can play right side defence or left side defence. He's English, homegrown, young, probably looks good in images in the way that their last English centre-back, Harry Maguire, never did. I think they've offered £35 million guaranteed with $8 million of bonuses, which Everton have rejected, not surprisingly. They are also trying in the centre-back position for Lenny Yoro, the Lille central defender, who is wanted pretty much by all of the top teams in Europe at the moment. He will move this summer because he's only got 1 year left in his Lille contract. Lille want to cash in and have said they will sell him. The problem is they have Liverpool also very strongly interested. Paris Saint-Germain would take the player if they can agree a fee with Lille. And most difficult of all is Real Madrid. So the Ferrari of European football have done what they do, and I think one of the secrets of their big success in recent years in the Champions League is they are the most appealing club to these young or younger talents coming through, and they've specifically targeted them and signed one after another and built themselves one of the strongest squads in European football off the back of it. And expectation is that Yoro will hang on and see if Madrid get the fee that Lille will accept and choose to go with them, although PSG, for example, are still waiting to find out if that's going to be the case. He's an interesting centre-back. We tend to think that European-based centre-backs are going to be very good on the ball and bringing the ball back out into possession. He's actually quite a safe, dependable, strong last man in the line player. Passes simple, doesn't really try to take the ball past opponents, but has been very effective to the point where he's got this kind of level of attention on him. Up front, there is some information that they're looking at Bologna's centre forward, Joshua Zirkzee. Again, why did they go for someone like that? He has a €40 million release clause, so he is attainable at a reasonable price. Would offer an alternative option at centre forward, take some of the pressure off their current options there and allow them to play two up front if they wanted to. A very tall kind of reference centre forward, described by a friend of mine who's involved in hiring players for European clubs as a top talent but a crazy individual. So if they do go for him or they do manage to secure him, I think there's an element of risk involved. But I think generally this is the category of players we're going to see United trying to secure in this window. It's younger age range, lower price range, not bottom of the market, but accessible price ranges with multiple potential years at the club.
Yeah, so it's a building for the future rather than building for now. But you said earlier they're looking for the next Mbappe and the next Bellingham. How about Ethan Mbappe and Joe Bellingham? Maybe they should go for those as options. They'll find them easy there. But one player, obviously, it's getting linked to everybody at the moment is Michael Olise, and I think Manchester United are obviously one of the clubs in for him. And we've on football transfers we had Jack Talbot has linked him to Liverpool. He's a big one that obviously Man United fans will be eager to see come to the club, but I think you have a bit more information on him than maybe what's out there at the moment.
Yeah, look, I think he is an obvious potential target for Manchester United because he's an obvious potential target for all of the top clubs in the Premier League. He's one of the outstanding young, he's just 22 years of age, with proven ability in the Premier League. He scored 10 goals in 19 Premier League matches last season despite having multiple injuries, 6 assists also. So we know that analytics are fundamental to recruitment in modern football. So when you do that kind of thing at that age in the top division, you automatically come out on the top of these potential recruit lists. He has a release clause. That release clause, I'm reliably told, has been misreported. So the figure that's gone out in the media is that it's £60 million. I'm told that it's more than £60 million. There's also been a bit of reporting that it's only accessible for Champions League clubs. I'm also told that it's not restricted to Champions League clubs. And I think that's actually deliberate on Crystal Palace's part. And I think a key element here is we have to pay attention to that you're trying to sign from Crystal Palace and you're trying to sign from Steve Parish. And Steve Parish is one of the most effective operators in the transfer market in English football. Doesn't allow his players to leave easily. He doesn't allow players to leave unless the circumstances suit him. So that when they signed this new contract with Olise, which was in August, it's an improved 4-year deal, that came after Chelsea tried to take him on his previous release clause last summer, and they failed because they did not follow the correct legal procedure to activate that release clause. And Parish was able to block the move off the back of it and get him to sign a new contract, increase the value, and place himself in a position where if someone matches it this summer, he will get a higher fee and a very significant fee for the player. And we've seen in the past week it reported that Chelsea have been granted permission to speak to the player, which is an indication that they've told Parish they will meet the release clause, should the player agree to join to them. I would see that as a very specific strategy in Crystal Palace's part to use Chelsea as a market maker. They are demonstrating there that the highest spending club in the division are prepared to meet their price, which means everyone else, be that Liverpool, be that Manchester United, be that Newcastle United, Bayern Munich have also been mentioned as potential suitors, which makes sense to me. They now know they're going to have to, if Olise agrees to join Chelsea, if he agrees personal terms with them, which I think there is a good chance that he will do. There's another factor here in that his agent, who is one of these agents who doesn't have many players, is due to be banned by FA for a 6-month period after this window ends. So he is incentivized to get this deal through this window so he can be the agent acting on the deal. So if Chelsea agree personal terms with Olise, then the price is established and then it becomes a fight to match that price or better it, and Parish at least gets the release clause or gets more down the line. So I think there's a good chance that this one will run on for a while, and I think we should also note that the sporting directors at Chelsea, I think 18 months ago, they went to Benfica to sign Enzo Fernandez. They told Benfica that they would match the release clause for Enzo Fernandez in initial informal conversations with them. They were given permission to speak to the player. They convinced the player by offering him a huge salary increase over Benfica to the point where he agitated for the move. And then they came back to Benfica and offered, I forget the exact number, but it was 20, 30 million less than the release clause. And Rui Costa, the president of Benfica, was infuriated with it, and we had this really messy, probably 2-week period, in which they finally negotiated out a deal which came very close to the release clause in the end. I would suspect, and it's just my suspicion, that Parish will be paying attention exactly to the phrasing of what Chelsea are doing, because people in the market have noted what Chelsea have done in other circumstances and noted that what they did with Fernandes in terms of a verbal agreement was reneged on down the line. But I think there's a lot of play in this one, and I think with Jack Talbot's story that Liverpool have entered the conversation makes a lot of sense, because he is an obvious replacement for Mohamed Salah, who, if he doesn't leave this summer, I think we have to expect to leave next summer when he's a free agent, and who has a standing invitation to move to the Saudi Pro League whenever he wants, at essentially whatever salary he and his agent want to negotiate with the Saudis.
Yeah, so obviously he's a big one for Liverpool fans to keep an eye on, especially if they try for this long-term Salah plan, replacement plan. But you mentioned Chelsea are obviously are allowed to talk to them, but how will they actually be able to spend this money? Because we've seen obviously the financial concerns and FFP and all this sort of thing about Chelsea spending money, and they have to curb the massive spending they've made so far. So how would Chelsea actually be able to afford or give the money to Crystal Palace for Olise, if that's what they want to do?
They've done a couple of things recently. For the last financial year, they sold the 2 hotels at Stamford Bridge to a company owned by their investors for £76.5 million, and added that to their books, turning I think it was £166 million loss into an £89 million loss on their accounts, which allowed them to sneak in through PSR. There's some interesting stuff that's been put into the public domain in recent weeks, that they have made some applications to sell the training ground, or to transfer the ownership of the training ground, with a potential valuation on that of over £100 million. So if they're able to do, that's another substantial book profit added, which will enable them to get around PSR. I should say, on the transfer of the hotels, there was a Premier League vote over that at the summer meeting, which was designed to outlaw, or was aimed at outlawing, those kind of inter-club, within-club financial attempts to bypass the spirit of PSR laws, and it failed. It didn't get the 14-club vote required to go through. So that's basically been sanctioned by the Premier League, and an incentive to Chelsea and other clubs who want to go down this line. We know that Aston Villa, for example, I'm not saying this is what they're going to do, but we know that Aston Villa are very unhappy with the PSR regulations, and that one of their co-owners has threatened legal action over them recently. So I think they are very careful about managing this and finding ways around the regulations. Obviously, they have the opportunity to sell homegrown players. They briefed in January that they were open to selling Conor Gallagher, and are actively trying to do that. Reece James is one of the options that they could sell at high profit. Again, these homegrown players, as the full value of the transfer fee gets booked as profit, so it's got big impact on FFP, PSR for them. Yesterday, they agreed a deal to sell Ian Maatsen to Aston Villa for £37.5 million. So that's all homegrown profit benefit to them. And I think we will see them sell more of their homegrown players as they go through this window, in order to give them the opportunity to bring even more players in. Whether that's the best way to restructure Chelsea, I don't know. I think pretty much every person I speak to who's involved in professional football, involved as sports directors or scouts or coaches, the first comment they have about the way the Chelsea squad has been rebuilt is there's no spine to it, there's no experience to it, there's no culture to it, because all the players are new and there are no references within the dressing room for the players. So this continual overhaul, which has been very deliberate by the Americans, is actually self-defeating from a team-building perspective.
You probably see that a bit more in American sport, where you have the draft every year and you get rid of the big guys. And in American football, you have these initial contracts after drafting a player for 4 or 5 years, and you get them in on these cheap contracts, and then by the time it comes to offer them the big contract after they've done everything for you already, you move them on and try and get a younger, better player. And that seems to be the kind of Chelsea approach. And I think maybe they could live to regret letting some of these names go, because Maatsen to Aston Villa, I'm very excited to see what he does at Aston Villa if that move is completed, because he was excellent for Dortmund. Obviously, a lot of people saw him in the Champions League, what he did for them in the Champions League, but watching him on a weekly basis in the Bundesliga, he was one of the reasons that they excited at times, and they were able to put in convincing performances in the Bundesliga, because they were a poor team, a very inconsistent team in Germany for large parts of the season, and then in the Champions League and in big games they were able to rely on him, and he can be an excellent attacking outlet, and he should be a great player next season for Aston Villa. And I think fancy football fans might all have him in their team by the end of the season, because he offers so much going forward for them.
Yeah, well, he was one of the best players for Burnley in that promotion season for them, so he's proven in the harder end of English football, if you like. And I agree with you, he played the Champions League final, was a key part of getting there. He's proven himself at that top European level, and I think a very good acquisition. I think it should be a very good acquisition for Villa, and I think you're also right to point out those parallels between American sports recruitment and what Chelsea are doing, because there's no doubt that they have looked at European football, and you can actually find you'll find a YouTube video of him talking about how badly organised the vast majority of European football clubs are, how they don't really know what they're doing in terms of maximising value of asset, and how we're going to come in and we're going to take our American wisdom from sports, apply it to European football, and it's going to be really easy to succeed. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but he said that not long after the takeover, and you can see that they have adopted a lot of American sports rationale about recruitment and tried to apply it to European football, where there are so many differences, but one of the big ones is the peril of relegation and not having drafts to choose players from. Before we finish this section, we'll just talk about Pedro Lima, who I think 2 or 3 weeks ago we reported on the website and on the podcast that Chelsea were trying to make him one of the latest young Brazilian South American talents to add to their cadre. They'd offered €7 million with 3 million of performance-related variables to Sport Recife for the player. They lost him this week to Wolves, who managed to secure the player with a better bid than that. Chelsea, I'm told, responded by matching the bid, but the player ultimately chose Wolves because he felt that being able to go to the Premier League team immediately, he'll be integrated into the first team squad for this season, will make it more likely that he'll be able to achieve his goal of playing for Brazil in the 2026 World Cup. Chelsea's plan was to either sign him direct for themselves or sign him for Strasbourg. If they signed him direct for himself, he would have been loaned to Strasbourg for the season, which he was open to, but he felt that the Wolves offer was more attractive. Also, it never came to a formal proposal, but there was an informal proposal from Manchester City to sign him. I think their initial offer was €6 million. This was earlier in the process, and place him at one of the City Football Group clubs for development purposes.
You can understand why he's made that decision. It seems to be, if playing for Brazil is what he wants, Wolves looks to be the best path rather than just loan to Strasbourg, and that probably ties in a bit to what we had with the Manchester United conversation earlier. You need to show that there is this path for the players to come, and you're coming to a great setup, and for a young player like him, going to Wolves is the right path, because he's seen previous young players come through and previous players go on and play for the international team, and he can hopefully be one of them. But listening to the teams that have been linked and wanted to sign him, like you're saying, he does seem a very enticing prospect. And another reason for fans like Villa with Maatsen, Wolves fans can now be excited going into the new season, and that they will have someone tasty to look forward to seeing in action. But we obviously need to see where Olise goes and what happens with him. But one of the teams you mentioned was Newcastle and him. But I think they might have bigger priorities at the moment, or different priorities. They need to bring in a goalkeeper.
They have a number of targets that they want for this summer. My prediction will be that they do more work than maybe we have expected them to do. Newcastle have for quite a long time now fed a story that they are extremely tightly bound by financial fair play and PSR. You even saw their chief executive Darren Eales talking publicly in January about every player in the Newcastle United squad having a price, and that they might need to, the phrase he used was reload on certain positions in order to work within PSR rules, which saw a lot of reporting that Alexander Isak would be available in this window, that Bruno Guimaraes would be available in this window, and that kind of, I don't know if it was exactly the same time, but it wasn't far away from Guimaraes signing a new contract with Newcastle, which included a defined release clause. So there'd been an expectation that those were the players that they would accept, that they had to sell, even though they were key first team players. Again, I don't think we will see either of those guys go in this window. And I think what we're going to see is some of the fringe is unfair, but some of the players who would kind of naturally rotate out of the squad from normal squad planning be moved on. So you have Miguel Almiron, who's now 30, who was linked to a Saudi Pro League move in January, whose agent said recently that the Saudi Arabia market is hovering there. And I would not be surprised at all if we see Almiron moving to the Saudi Pro League in this window, and a substantial transfer fee going into Newcastle United's coffers. I think there's also the potential for Callum Wilson to move, and I think the most lucrative market to move him to would be the Saudi Pro League. He's now 32, was very effective when he got on the pitch last season, but as has been the case for the majority of the latter half of his career, he's been plagued with injury and only started 9 Premier League games last season. So those two are definitely players that, as I understand it, they are looking to move and have been courting the Saudi Arabian market for, and obviously they have some quite substantially strong contacts in the Saudi Arabian market. They want a goalkeeper, a new goalkeeper in to compete with Nick Pope and provide cover for Nick Pope as necessary. They have made an offer, actually made, as I understand it, multiple offers now for Burnley's James Trafford, who was in England's provisional Euro squad, England under-21 international, joined Burnley last summer for an initial £15 million and started the Premier League season, was eventually dropped out of the squad in favour of the goalkeeper who brought them up from the Championship. I think he will be sold this summer, but Burnley have a definite asking price. They are due a sell-on clause to Manchester City, and they have other suitors for the player. As I understand it, Chelsea are interested amongst those clubs that are interested in Trafford, but Newcastle are pushing hard for that one and would like to have a goalkeeper in as soon as possible. There's been stories in Spain that they'd agreed a fee with Valencia for Georgi Mamardashvili, the Georgian national team goalkeeper, who a lot of people think is the best goalkeeper in Spain at present. He will definitely be sold this summer. Valencia are a club that capitalise on their assets. They have a strict policy of only bringing players in when they have a player going out, and ideally a player going out for a transfer fee. They recently signed as a free agent the Rayo Vallecano goalkeeper Stole Dimitrescu, so they've already signed Mamardashvili's replacement, and I think we will see him move to a bigger club in Europe this summer, but it doesn't look like that's going to be Newcastle. The focus appears to be on James Trafford just now.
Yeah, Marmardishvili could be an interesting one, all right, because he was obviously the name that was touted maybe to replace Courtois at Real Madrid when he got injured, and before Kepa and Lunin came in, he was tipped that he could be a Real Madrid kind of level goalkeeper, at least an interim Real Madrid level goalkeeper. So I think there will be a lot on the market for him, and especially if he can put in good performances for Georgia at the Euros. Obviously, they lost their first game, but he went up for that corner at the end, and Turkey were able to score a third goal. But I think he's shown for Valencia and La Liga that he is an outstanding prospect in goal, and I think his stock is only going to continue to rise. So maybe Newcastle might be missing out on someone if they decide to go for Trafford instead of him. But obviously Trafford knows the Premier League, and he can be someone to battle with Nick Pope for that number one spot. But Marmardishvili, I have high hopes for it. I'm interested to see where he will end up.
Yeah, I think Trafford has the advantage of being English and homegrown, which is always attractive. I think the price is relatively cheap for a player of that profile. And I agree with you on Marmardishvili, and he also has the advantage of a physique where you'd think he's very well suited to Premier League football. You can understand why Newcastle had been looking at him, but have decided, as I am told, that he's too expensive for them at present, and that the money that they're going to be drawing from these sales needs to be allocated to other areas of the team.
Yeah, of course, and obviously if the Saudi money comes in, that's great. If it moves to the Saudi Pro League, and I think the Euros as well is probably showing us a bit that the Saudi Pro League isn't maybe the retirement home that many people have thought, myself included, that you can still put in good performances. N'Golo Kante getting a man-to-match performance, and he's been in the Saudi Pro League, and that these players, maybe it isn't a drop down in quality.
Yeah, I think there's a misconception. It's definitely the case that they have the strongest league, and they had the strongest league in the Middle East. And it's not a retirement home. It's intense, and they actually play a huge number of games. And one of the complaints of some of the European-based players who've moved to the Saudi Pro League is the schedule's relentless. There are a lot of cup tournaments. There's the Asian Champions League. The league itself has a lot of games in it. So, they're not going there and doing nothing, the majority of them. And I think you're right to point out that some of these guys have come out of the Saudi Pro League and are performing in the Euros and to a reasonable level.
Yeah, they'll definitely want to keep an eye on, because it looked like it could have been a flash in the pan, but ended up not being, say, like China a few years ago or whatever. This seems to be continuous, and we should expect to see Saudi bids come in for players this summer, and it makes it interesting, and it puts money back into the European market then that can be spent on other players and spread around through various other teams, just like Ajax are looking to get a bit of money. And I think Steven Bergwijn is one player that could be on the way to the Premier League.
Yes.
Couldn't he?
Yeah. Just before we talk about Bergwijn, because you raised that about Saudi, and I'll go back to it because it's such an important factor in this market. The European clubs and Premier League clubs in particular are waiting for that Saudi money. They are factored in. They spent, I think, over $500 million last summer, if I'm not mistaken, and they are the only realistic outlet for a lot of the players that Premier League clubs are trying to offload, because the Premier League pays so much in transfer fees and pays so much in wages, and because all of the other major European leagues have been suppressed in economic performance of late, it's quite hard to offload a player who has either failed in the Premier League or hasn't quite reached expectations, someone like Thomas Partey, for example, to a European club. And the Saudi Pro League has been the get out of jail card, and there's an expectation that will happen again. And I think the Saudi Pro League, you're right, they're not going away. The money's still there to be invested. But I think they are monitoring this and deciding what the best way to act is. How exactly do they target their cash this summer? Do they go for the older players, or do they go for a younger age range of players? And to what extent do they help out the Premier League? I hear stories about a queue of agents lining up in Riyadh, waiting to speak to various people of importance involved in the Saudi Pro League. And it's quite a complex organisation structure they have over there. There's a lot of decision makers involved. And I'm not getting a clear message about which way it'll go, but whichever way it goes is going to have a big impact in this summer window. And for sure, the European clubs and the Premier League clubs in particular are waiting to see, do we get that cash influx, which will allow us, as you say, to reinvest and restructure.
Yeah, that queue of agents could do with that app that we were talking about earlier. They could be swiping for the players and clubs. It could be easier to make a match. Once I finish recording this podcast, I might go and see how much it's going to cost to develop, and then I'll see, can I sell it to the Saudi Pro League. Yeah, so I was trying to talk about Steven Bergwijn, but you had excellent points to make as always. So yeah, Ajax want to sell, and obviously there's interest from the Premier League. So what can you tell me about that?
Yeah, Ajax, as we know, had their worst season for years. A great deal of turmoil within the club. They need to clean the decks in multiple ways. Some very bad signings made under the previous sporting director, who has been shifted out of the club under quite a cloud. I don't think Bergwijn is necessarily the worst of those signings, but he was a very expensive signing in 2022. 31.25 million euros they paid Tottenham Hotspur for Bergwijn, who was fringe would be unfair, but he wasn't an established starter for Tottenham. I think Daniel Levy must have been delighted with that deal. Obviously, they did it in the context of taking the best part of 150 million euros in transfer fees off Manchester United for Antony and Lisandro Martinez. So they were probably feeling quite happy with themselves at that stage. But interesting aside on that Antony deal was, while it was ongoing, I asked someone at Ajax what the price was for Antony, and was given a figure of around, I think, 75 million as Manchester United were bidding. And then by 2 weeks further down the line, he was saying, no, our asking price is 100 million, because they'd realised how desperate United were for this player, and they were basically going to make one of the killings of all time on this deal. But Bergwijn is one of the best paid players at the club. They are actively courting Premier League interest. West Ham United tried to sign him in January and didn't get that deal through. As I understand it, they're also interested in the player for the summer. And Ajax will sell because they need to, as I'm told, that they need to sell before they start recruiting themselves. I think there's a very good chance we'll see Bergwijn back in the Premier League for this coming season.
It'll be a very interesting one to come back. Obviously, there's a point to prove maybe for him if he does come back. So he could have the bit between his teeth when he does come back, and could make a big impact next time around for whoever gets him. And I think the point you're raising repeatedly is teams are waiting to sell players before buying players, and Bournemouth seems to be one of those teams that are looking to sell players, and it's difficult at the moment to sell some of the players, and especially with maybe the players that they're trying to get off their books currently.
I think with Bournemouth, it's more a case of they're similar to Brentford and Brighton in that they're trying to establish themselves as a Premier development club, a club that brings good players in, mostly from the European market, gives them the platform in the Premier League. Once they've achieved there, they want to sell for a profit and then reinvest and repeat that path. Obviously, they have not done that as successfully as Brentford and Brighton have, but they've just invested in a new, he's not actually sporting director, I think they've called him president of football operations, Tiago Pinto, who was at AS Roma and Benfica before that, and that reflects that he's going to be part of overseeing their multi-club network, which includes Hibernian in Scotland. But they have an opportunity to sell Dominic Solanke this summer, who was actually the fourth highest scorer in the Premier League last season, 19 goals in 38 games, same return as Ollie Watkins, which is saying something, doing it for Bournemouth as opposed to a team that qualified for the Champions League. Totally outperformed his goal returns from previous years. He has 10 in 96 in Premier League games spread across multiple seasons prior to that. He's 26 years old, so he's at the age where if you are going to cash in, you need to do it now. But he is a demonstrably proven Premier League scorer off the last season. They would sell Solanke if they get a taker, and he has a £65 million release clause. So if someone wants to go that far, they can get him. And I think there's always a market for proven Premier League goal scorers. And I think, given we discussed Alexander Isak earlier, I think if you were going through the division and trying to pick out prime properties, you would say Ollie Watkins and Alexander Isak would be the ones you would try and get. They're going to be super complicated because neither of the clubs want to let them go, and Newcastle, although it seemed like they did, actually want to retain. So then you go down another grade and you say Dominic Solanke, we can get him from Bournemouth. So if someone towards the end of the window perhaps wants that proven Premier League English talent, he's there, and Bournemouth are definitely open to selling. The other one that's interesting here is Milos Kerkez, a Hungarian left-back who they signed last summer from Alkmaar, who's travelled around a lot in his career. He's just 20 years of age, playing in the Euros, was at Milan before he was at Alkmaar. He's being monitored by Arsenal, Chelsea and Manchester United, who are all in the market for a left-back. Super athletic, very good attacking, questionable from a tactical perspective, I think, at this sense. And this is the guidance I have, is that Andoni Iraola hasn't been particularly happy with Kerkez from a tactical perspective, and there's been a bit of dispute between him and the player. Player's not particularly happy with Bournemouth because he's being subbed off and left out of some of the games, even though he feels he's performing well. So I think there's an opportunity for that to be exploited should a club be ready to go in with a very high fee. Bournemouth tell me that they don't want to sell, that he's not available, and that it would take at least 40 million to get him out. But he's one of these players who has a father who's very involved in the process, and his father, I'm told, is really keen to move him on, and something of a complication in all of this. But definitely we should pay attention to Milos Kerkez, because if one of those top clubs decides he's the right answer at left back, and as I say, Arsenal, Chelsea, Man United all need to improve in that position, I think that's an accessible one too.
Yeah, will be an interesting one to keep an eye on, and maybe it's surprising the kind of calibre of club that's been linked with him. Because like you said, he's moved around a lot and he's not found his footing yet, and that kind of is a negative sign for some teams that might put them off, that he doesn't maybe have the loyalty or the staying power yet, that he's gone from club to club. But I suppose if he is going to one of these big clubs, where do you go after that? So it could be a way to keep him around if you are a big club. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting one to keep an eye on. And now it's that regular time of the podcast where we come to our hero and villain. I think you can pick the hero, Duncan, because I love picking villains.
Yeah, and I usually do the villains. I want to give someone some praise for a change. I'm too often criticising on this podcast. Heroes, I think it's a group heroes this time, and I think it goes to a lot of the supporters at the European Championship. You can hear the quality of the atmosphere in the games. You see a lot of the players commenting after the match just how good an environment it's been to play and how intense an environment it's been to play. And I think it's down to the supporters, but I think it's down to something which I've always enjoyed about European football. It has that special edge to it because it's players representing their country on the top stage, and I think it just divorces it a bit from the commercialism of the club game at the top level these days, and you get that specialness, that uniqueness to it, which is one of the things that I think we all fell in love with football for in the first place.
Yeah, it was what I fell in love with Italia 90 and watching the Robert round. I was a bit too young for Euro 88 and Ireland's historics at Euro 88, but Italia 90 was the first kind of football that I remember watching. And then growing up with World Cup in 1994, everybody coming out on the streets, the flags and the houses, the kind of international football is different. I know everyone complains about international breaks, but
yeah,
the international tournaments, nobody complains about international tournaments. It just brings football fans together in a way that club football perhaps doesn't, and it's great to see Scotland back there again and their fans doing them proud. Yeah, it's wonderful to see, and it's just a pity Ireland aren't there. So my villain ties in a bit to that. I'm going for a European Championships kind of team, and my villain is German efficiency is the villain I'm going for, because it doesn't seem to be as efficient as it should be. We saw scenes of England fans and the English media were posting their struggles to get to and from the match in Gelsenkirchen. Schalke fans are obviously used to it, but for an international tournament you expect the logistics to be better. There to be more trains, more trams, more buses, more public transport to and from the matches, and it's sad to see fans get stuck in these situations and not being able to get home after matches back to their hotels and things like that. Hopefully by the end of the tournament and the next few games and the next few match days that these kind of issues get resolved, because I know German bureaucracy is all over the place. A lot of places are still using fax machines and post and written letters, so it might take a while to solve some of these issues. But German efficiency is definitely taking a hit, and people have woken up to realise that maybe it's not all it's cracked up to be.
Hey, I must say, Ronan, I was surprised when I saw that, because having covered the World Cup in Germany, I think it was pretty close to being the best organised tournament I've ever been to, and certainly in the majority of the stadium it was really easy to get around the country. The public transport was superb, intercity trains running through the night. You basically go to a game, work till 10 in the night, then get on a train and sleep on the train and land up in the next city where you had to cover a match. Yeah, something's clearly gone wrong there, because they definitely had it sorted when they had the World Cup.
Thanks very much. You've been listening to the Transfers podcast powered by FootballTransfers.com. Please subscribe to our feed on your preferred podcast platform, rate us, review us, and even tell your friends. So we now have a WhatsApp channel as well, so you can search for the Transfers podcast on WhatsApp or follow the link in the show notes to find it there. You can also follow messages on Facebook, Instagram and YouTube at Transfers Podcast, and you can follow us on Twitter at TransfersCast, where we'd like to build a community there, so we will follow you back if you drop us a follow there, so it's always good to give us a follow. You can follow Duncan, obviously, at Duncan Castles. I'm at Swear I'm Not Paul on Twitter. That's too long to explain for this, but if you send me a message I might reply separately. Our music
you can explain it to me, Ronan. I'd meant to ask you why you're I Swear I'm Not Paul.
Okay, we'll power on. The listeners can be in for a treat. So I used to have a music blog, and I needed a name for it. So back when blogging became a thing, I needed a name for it. So I called it that. But the reason that it was called Swear I'm Not Paul is I used to work, when I was still in college, I had a customer service job at a software company, and 95% of the customer service emails that would come in were the same 4 or 5 questions. So the guy there before us had made templated emails to send out, and it was always when I started, I was like, oh, these templates are great, I'll just send them out. But I was too lazy at that time to even change the kind regards Paul at the end of the email. So anytime someone, which was rare enough, anytime that someone would ring up on the phone and ask to speak to someone, they would ask to speak to Paul. So everyone in the office started to call me Paul. Yeah, after a while I swore I wasn't Paul. When I needed a name for my music blog, I went with that, and it's been my handle on social media for the past decade or more since. But yeah, still get people sometimes on Twitter call me Paul, even though my name is clearly printed there as not Paul. So you can follow me at Swear I'm Not Paul on Twitter. So yeah, thanks for that. Yeah.
Thanks for explaining it, Paul.
But you're welcome. Yeah. If you Google Duncan Castles on Wikipedia, I think you get some fancy castle in Scotland. So it's probably the same for you. Our music and production, as always, is by Mark Caulfield at World Podcast Production, and we'll be back next week, as always. Stay stay safe, be well, and thank you very much for listening.